For it to go dee. There it goes. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's workshop on, well, it's actually not a workshop. It's more of an info session on project drafting. As always, I am your host. My name is Janie Adams, and I'm the Curator of Education for the Arizona Historical Society. And I am also, perhaps more importantly, the Arizona Affiliate Coordinator for National History Day. And I am joined, as always, by Allison Avery, who is the Curator of Education, and she's also the Central Arizona Regional Coordinator. So today we're going to spend not a ton of time, just spend a little bit of time thinking about project drafting. How do I go from my working thesis statement and my research to like a finished product or close to a finished product, right? We know that sometimes we're writing 8, 9, 10 drafts of the same project. And it always feels like everything you always have the inclination to want to keep making little tweaks. Sometimes you have to fight that inclination. Sometimes you just got to give into it. But let's get started. So absolutely, first and foremost, when you are drafting any project, read the rules. Read the rules. It doesn't matter what you're working on. It doesn't matter if you're working on just an assignment for school, something for National History Day, a thesis when you go to college, perhaps a college admissions writing sample. Read the rules. Understand the parameters. Word mins and word maxes, time limits, not a suggestion. Absolutely not a suggestion. Wait till you get to grad school before you start like playing with the forms of projects. For now, read the rules, understand what it is that you're doing, right? If you're making a documentary for National History Day and your documentary is 11 minutes long, it's too long. Okay, so connecting your research to your thesis statement. I want to start this project drafting info session by saying that revising your thesis is not bad. If you have to revise your thesis, you did not make a mistake, you didn't screw up. As a matter of fact, revising your thesis statement is always good practice, and you should always be open to the concept of having to revise your thesis statement. Sometimes our best idea, not our greatest idea. That's okay. Or rather, I said that wrong. Sometimes our first idea is not our best idea, and that's totally fine. So take a moment to sit with your research. Gather all your research in front of you, gather your annotated bibliography. Remember to annotate as you go. Do not try to do it all the night before it's due. So gather your annotations, gather all your research, and ask yourself some questions. What conclusion is my research trying to make? What conclusion is my research bringing me to? Is it still in line with my working thesis? I really encourage you to write a working thesis and to do some drafting of your project before you even start researching, but not everyone does. So think about your working thesis, think about kind of the idea that you had in your head going into your research. Did you learn something new or consider something from a different perspective? And did that new idea change your conclusion about the historical event that you were trying to do your research on, right? So did you find a document that totally blew the whole roof off the thing, and then you realize that the assumption that you had made about this historical event is no longer true? And sometimes those assumptions are earth-shattering and totally change the historiography and change the direction of historical research. And sometimes it's those quiet little everyday observations that we all make. So if you didn't write a working thesis, or if you're struggling to write a thesis, you want to check out the recorded workshop on thesis writing and secondary sources, and that's going to be on the NHDAZ website under the Students tab. But we'll talk a little bit about thesis statements today too. Okay, so here's an example of a thesis statement that I wrote. Admittedly, not a great thesis statement, but we'll go with it. So my working thesis statement for my project is something like, the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment highlighted political differences between the states in the 1970s. That's an okay thesis statement. Not a whole lot of meat there, but it's okay. It's a good place to get started while I'm doing my research. And then let's say I've pulled some examples of the things that I found during the course of my research. Let's say I found pamphlets about women's liberation and feminism. Remember that the Equal Rights Amendment is happening at the same time as second wave feminism. So things are really getting shook up. Educational opportunities for women, military service for women, and I'm finding information that's for that, and I'm finding information that's against that. And then I'm finding information about marriage and birth rates in the United States. And I'm starting to put all these things together. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe this debate isn't about politics anymore. Maybe this is about something bigger. So questions that I'm going to ask myself when I'm looking at my working thesis statement and I'm looking at the research that I've started pulling together, does my thesis statement still make sense, even though I have all of this information now? How can I refine my thesis statement to communicate my findings a little bit more clearly? So now that we have those kind of questions floating around in our head, we're going to talk about how to actually revise your thesis statement. Listen to what your research is actually telling you. Who are the groups involved? Is there a very specific location that is important for understanding the historical context? Are we only hearing the perspectives of some people or certain people? How does that change the way that the story is told? So a refresher on thesis statements. Every thesis statement in the whole wide world boils down to thing is thing because XYZ, where the things are generally nouns, ideas, concepts. Sometimes they're like jargon words. They're basically kind of the two things that you are comparing. That comparison verb is a placeholder for any verb. If you're really struggling to write a thesis statement for, say, your National History Day project, I would just steal one of the verbs from the annual theme, right? So thing debates thing. Thing was a successful diplomatic measure because, well, thing was and then one of your other things is a successful diplomatic measure. But really think about what is that verb that's happening in the annual theme, and how can I take that verb and put it into my thesis statement to very clearly draw a connection between my thesis statement, my argument, and the annual theme. Because, that word because, lets the reader know that you have evidence to back up that claim. If you recall, when we talked about thesis statement, thing is just a declarative statement. It's not an argument. It's just a declaration. So that because is what makes it an argument. And it doesn't always have to be the word because. It can be due to, it can be for the fact that, however you want to play with it, but because is a really good placeholder. And then X, Y, and Z are the reasons that you know the relationship between the two things to be true, or a roadmap showing how you will prove your point. So let's think about my working thesis again. So just a reminder, my working thesis is the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment highlighted political differences between the states in the 1970s. That's a fine thesis statement. But let's say the research that I'm looking at is showing pamphlets about women's liberation, women's educational opportunities, women's military service, and then statistics about marriage and birth rates in the United States. And I'm starting to piece some of these things together. And I'm going, maybe this isn't about politics at all, right? Maybe this has something to do with gender. Maybe this has something to do with the anxiety surrounding changing gender roles in the 1970s. The 1960s and 1970s are sometimes considered the era of women's liberation. They're also sometimes considered the era of sexual liberation. People are playing with their sexuality a little bit more. And for a lot of people in places of power, that is very concerning. It is very concerning that people want to upend the status quo. So maybe, given my research, my revised thesis statement has something to do more with gender roles and anxiety about changing gender roles than it does to do with politics, right? So my revised thesis statement might be something like, the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment showed American anxieties about changing gender roles in the United States. And that's a great thesis statement to work with while I'm drafting my project. And like I said, it's not bad to revise your thesis statement. You might have to revise your statement many, 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 many times during the course of your project, but that's not bad. Really think about this as an opportunity to experiment. If you'll recall from some of our early workshops, I've mentioned that history is a social science, and the social sciences are still tied to the scientific method, right? So hypothesized, test, rehypothesize, retest, and then rehypothesize, retest forever until you get to some kind of conclusion. History is exactly the same way, right? We need to put forward some kind of hypothesis and then see, based on our research, whether or not our hypothesis is true. And then revise. Of course, always revise. So most thesis statements won't need a total overhaul like the previous example. I totally changed gears. Some will just need minor tweaks. So a really good example of something like that is maybe you're finding that instead of saying women as this kind of monolithic group, maybe you want to say Southern women. Maybe you want to say educated women. Maybe you want to say married women, right? So sometimes it's about making little tweaks to narrow your topic down and become more and more specific. Remember that when you're writing your thesis statement, it's important to be broad enough that you can actually find the material you're looking for, but not so broad that you can't make a point. You really need to strike a good balance between a broad topic and a narrow topic to find something that you can actually argue. This is a little advice from one historian to another. Do not throw anything away. Do not delete drafts. Do not delete paragraphs. Do not throw anything away. If you're going to make a big change, start a new draft. If you want to delete a paragraph, copy and paste it into another document, or use the strike through feature, right? Use the track changes feature and delete that. So you're not actually losing that material. It still exists. It's just not in your whatever space you're using to kind of visualize your project. So like when I am writing some kind of historical piece, I'll have two documents open. One is my draft, my actual draft of my piece. And the other document is like the dumping ground for all of the half ideas and ideas that might not work that I'm coming up with while I'm writing. So that's just something that I like to do, but do not throw anything away. Just create a new document. Just copy and paste all of that material over. You'll be kicking yourself if you decide later down the line, no, I actually liked my original thesis first, and now you don't have it. And you have to rewrite the whole thing. Okay, quick interlude. So if you're joining us for the roadmaps for National History Day, the secret code word for today's session is superior. Remember that if you're following along with your roadmap at home, your completed roadmap is due December 1st. And if you attend 7 of the workshops that we've offered this fall and turn in your paperwork by December 1st, we'll send you a little, or we'll give you a little treat at the state contest for National History Day. This is for National History Day in Arizona students only. Okay, so actually organizing your project. So it's really important to remember that your thesis statement is the roadmap for your entire project. Make sure that your body paragraphs or the sections of your project, if it's scenes in your documentary, if it's scenes in your performance, if it's labels on your exhibit, make sure that they align with how you've organized your ideas in your thesis statement. Exhibits are a little bit different because you're displaying that image visually, and so the eye can kind of jump around a little bit, but you want to make sure that you're still hitting all of the points that you addressed in your thesis statement. So for example, if my thesis statement is going to talk about the political, social, and economic ramifications of X debate, and I don't talk about the social ramifications of that debate, either I need to add that information in, or I need to revise my thesis statement. So while you may have found a lot of interesting ways to present your argument, you really want to make sure that your evidence that you're using is really tight. that you're using the best evidence that you have to convey your point. So you want to make sure that you only include those pieces of evidence that have the most information about your topic, or those pieces of evidence that most directly relate to your thesis statement. It's really important not to take a shotgun approach to your project and to be really, really focused. I know that for a lot of us, a 2,000 word paper is one of the longest papers that we've ever written, but 2,000 words really isn't a lot of, there's really not a lot of space there. So it's really important that you don't try to look at all of the facets of your topic, but you just pick maybe 2 or 3 that are really good illustrative points of your argument. I promise you that when you decide to write your doctoral dissertation, then you can include all of that other stuff, but really keep your paper tight for something like a 2,000 word paper. Okay, weaving your argument through your project. Always, 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 always connect back to your thesis statement. You always need to connect back to your thesis statement. So remember, every thesis statement is thing because XYZ. That is your roadmap, right? That is absolutely the way that you will be organizing your paper. Now, let's talk about how to actually organize a body paragraph. So this may be familiar to some of us, but this is a really common structure for something called the 5-paragraph essay. The 5-paragraph essay is an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. And in those body paragraphs, you will be discussing the relationship between whatever piece of evidence you have found and your thesis statement. So let's talk about this X part of thing is thing because XYZ. So let's say we're talking about section X. We want to have a topic sentence about the relationship between X and the things in your thesis, right? So if you're looking at, let's say your thesis statement is something about the, or that part of your thesis statement is something about the political ramifications of then this paragraph will be all about those political ramifications. So first you want to go with Exhibit A for why you believe that this relationship exists. So your first piece of evidence. And then once you introduce your first piece of evidence, you want to explain and analyze that piece of evidence, right? Always explaining why this evidence furthers your point. How does this piece of evidence further your argument? And then you can repeat that as necessary. I would really encourage you not to have not to go all the way around and loop the alphabet back over, right? We don't want to have exhibit A, B. But maybe like exhibit A, B, C, maybe even D, depending on what kind of material it is. You want to make sure that you're keeping your project really, really tight and you're only really selecting the best evidence to further your point. Just a reminder that if you find something that contradicts your point, you cannot ignore it. You have to talk about it, either in your project because it's an outlier or during your process internally while you're revising your thesis statement. So we have our exhibits and we have our explanation of our exhibits and how they further our argument. And then of course we have to have a concluding statement. So your conclusion restates the relationship between X and the things in your thesis statement. It's really important when you are writing a concluding sentence or a concluding paragraph that you don't include new information. You always just want to keep tying it back. Think about all of these different things as different pretty little ribbons that you can tie that connect back to your thesis statement. Every paragraph has to end with this cute little bow and it connects back to your thesis statement. Okay. Even if you are not writing a paper for National History Day. So for example, you're writing a performance, you're writing a script for a performance, or you're writing a documentary, or you're designing a website. You will still need to do some writing to sketch your project. Embrace it. Just embrace it. Write drafts, write yourself little notes, write paragraphs. You have to do some writing to help get your thoughts, get your argument, get your analysis out there into your project. So just embrace it. Just do some writing. I promise you it'll pay off. Make sure that every point that you make relates directly to your thesis statement. Like I said, we want to make sure that we're picking our best evidence. We're going to find a lot of really cool stuff while we're doing our research, but we just want to make sure that we're including the best evidence that we can include in our project. All that said, do not avoid evidence that contradicts your thesis statement. So if you're doing research and you find something that totally upsets your thesis statement and sends the whole project in a totally new direction, you cannot ignore that. Either do more research to see if it's an outlier, right? If this is just kind of one piece of evidence that contradicts your thesis statement, and if there is just kind of one piece of evidence that contradicts your thesis statement, consider finding a way to include that in your project, right? So what does it mean? What does it mean that there was one dissenter, for example? Or if you find lots of information that contradicts your thesis statement, consider revising your thesis statement. You want to make sure that you're not ignoring evidence that contradicts your thesis statement, but you're finding a way to incorporate that into your project, either by recognizing that it is an outlier or by revising your thesis statement. And that's kind of it for project drafting. If you have any specific questions about your specific type of project, you can send us an email, nhdaz@azhs.gov, or we're going to be having a category-specific workshop on November the 20th at 2 p.m. TBD exactly how we're going to do that, but it will definitely be virtual. So we'll either do appointment slots or we'll just kind of have one big group meeting depending. But that's where we're really going to cover the specific rules for each category, and you can ask more kind of category-specific questions. But until then, there's actually one more workshop, and that's not next weekend, but the weekend after. And that's going to be November 6th on historical context and student voice. What is historical context? What is student voice? How do I make my project exist within a historical moment? And how do I help my voice come through all the research, all the other things that I've been reading? So we'll see you then on November the 6th. And like I said, in the meantime, if you have any additional questions, you can email us at NHDAZ@azhs.gov. And we'll see you later. Have a happy Halloween.